All right, this is the video for the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. We'll just watch this quick video.
Frederick Douglass becomes a symbol of the liberation of slaves in the country. Frederick Douglass, born a slave, that somehow has the audacity and drive to run away from slavery and decides to become a leader against slavery. So not only does he have the mental capacity to see himself free, he has the audacity to say, I can speak for the slaves better than the abolitionists that speak on our behalf and don't understand our pain.
Frederick Douglass is important to America because, unlike most enslaved people in America, he actually makes it out of slavery, is able to tell his story, and is able to actually become an agent for change in the Black community, in America in general.
Frederick Douglass traveled the length and width and breadth of this country as a leading abolitionist that made the issue of slavery a paramount issue through his editing newspapers, through his ceaseless travels and lectures. He helped to make it a real movement that by the time Abe Lincoln is running against Douglass, it is a national discussion. It would not have happened if you didn't have a spokesperson that worked as tirelessly as Frederick Douglass.
Douglass is someone who is known in this country. He travels to England. He's an international figure. So he's important because he can tell you about slavery, the institution of slavery, because he lived it, and he can speak about that time period. He can tell you about escaping to freedom, and he can tell you about the free world. He bridges gaps. He's a part of transformation of America at this pivotal moment. And it's someone who, as I said, who begins under the cover of slavery and then ends outside of it.
All right, so Frederick Douglass was born into enslavement in Maryland at a time when slavery was still legal in many states in the Union. As Douglass grew up, he tried to escape several times. Finally, in 1838, he succeeded. Douglass went on to become a famous speaker and writer, fighting to abolish or end slavery. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, became a bestseller in the United States and in Europe.
From Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Autobiography by Frederick Douglass. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power, to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute.
All right. So as we start this in this autobiography of Frederick Douglass, we're only looking at a small piece of it. So first thing he brings up is Master Hugh's family, and he lived with them for 7 years. So we're looking at when he was younger and when he was still in slavery. And it looks like he's starting to talk about an individual occurrence or an important event from that time with them, which is learning to read and write. It says, my mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, so my mistress, the lady of the house, had started teaching him how to read, but then, with the advice of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, so her husband told her to stop it, but also had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. So she went from teaching him to read to not teaching him to read, and then preventing anyone else from teaching him to read. It says that she first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. So at first, she wasn't opposed to him learning to read, which is, of course, a very freeing skill that offered lots of opportunities and was pretty uncommon as far as slaves go. So lacked the moral corruption. So it's kind of implying that her husband um, set her down that path of moral corruption. Like, she didn't see that there was anything wrong with it until her husband was like, "We don't do this." Um,
My mistress was, as I've said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul, she commenced when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me.
so he's
When I
saying,
went there, she was
he's saying at the beginning, she was kind and tender-hearted, had a simple soul, and just treated him like another human being. But in becoming a slaveholder and adopting those responsibilities of being a slaveholder, she kind of changed in some way. So, and began to see him, or didn't see him at first as just property. And he makes the point that slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. So it changed him in his life, and it also changed her in her life.
pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities.
So divest her, so take away those heavenly qualities. So slavery took that kindness from her.
Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with a newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made all up a fury, and snatch from me a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From this time, I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L.
So as this mistress kind of went from treating him like a human to actually treating him like a slave, that change in her, happened during this time where Douglas sees an opportunity to learn to read, which again is a huge step up as far as important skills in order to become free. So after kind of making the mistake, as she became to see it, of starting to teach him to read, that mistake, he had gotten a little taste and now wanted to continue with it, and she had to like keep it from him, like keep away kind of. And then at the bottom he says, so he was watched all the time after she went through this change of like no more reading. And he says, mistress in teaching me the alphabet had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. So that's like that saying, take an inch, give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. So just if you get a little taste of something, you're going to keep fighting for it.
The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent of errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used also to carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. This bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who, in return, would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys as a testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them, but prudence forbids. Not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. It is enough to say of the dear little fellows that they lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgan and Bailey shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wished I could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy, and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got hold of a book entitled The Colombian Orator. Every opportunity I got, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found in it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times.
All right. So in his mistress stopping teaching him how to read, he had to turn to other people. So as a little kid, he would have to run errands. Where does it say that? Sent on errands. He would just take some bread, which was a plentiful resource at the house, and exchange a little reading lesson for bread from the little boys that he could find on the street. And then it talks about the Colombian orator and this story he's introducing. So he's learned to read, and now we're kind of moving on to this first instance of how much reading and writing affected him in this dialogue between a master of a slave in this book.
The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed of by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired, though unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on the part of the master.
So in this book he's reading as he's 12 years old, he encounters this story of a slave that's run away 3 times. And after being brought back for the third time, the slave and the master sit down and have a conversation. And the master brings up all the points why slavery is a good thing. And the slave discounts all of the points and is eventually emancipated or set free.
In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches on and in behalf of Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on another, even more painful than the one of which I was relieved.
So in this same book, we see, or Douglas sees speeches on and in behalf of Catholic emancipation, so the freedom or the freeing of people. They gave tongue to an interesting thoughts of my soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. The moral of which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of a slaveholder. So he's had these thoughts before about the power of truth over the consciousness of a slaveholder. So making a slaveholder see the error of their ways, as far as like basically giving them a guilty conscience about owning people in general. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery, so saying slavery is bad, and a powerful vindication of human rights, so slaves are people, which were two radically drastic or different ideas from everything around Douglas. So it kind of emboldened his thoughts that slavery is bad and people don't deserve to be enslaved.
The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who had left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel the learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out.
So, although these speeches that he was reading emboldened his thoughts that slavery is wrong and people don't deserve to be enslaved, he also makes the point that it began to feel a curse as rather than a blessing, because he was in a place that was very difficult to do anything about his situation. So he knew how bad he had it, but he couldn't do anything about it. And he attributed that to being able to read in the first place. If he couldn't read, he wouldn't have all of these thoughts kind of like swimming around in his brain.
In moments of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared, to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, and seen in everything. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm.
So up here, just continuing that thought of the blessing and curse that reading kind of gave to him. He says, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. So, kind of invoking that ignorance is bliss if you don't know what you're missing. And he comes to discuss freedom had now appeared to disappear no more than ever. And then this all rest of the text, he's just describing how freedom was all around him and yet he can't have it, and the torture that kind of offered. All right, and that is the text for the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass.